This is the City of Waupaca's City Plan Commission meeting.
One thing that'll look a little different tonight as we move through the conversation is Jeff has prepared a document that will kind of do a comparative of the key points that we're going to touch on. So old code, this is how it looked. New code, this is how it's proposed to look. And we can have conversations on each point that way. Jeff's also going to try to treat it from like a standpoint of himself being John Doe, and I'm coming in to go through this process in this area of the zoning code, and this is what it would look like for me as a resident or a business owner or whatever it may be. So that's kind of what you can expect tonight. I know this is set as an action item, guys, but to be honest with you, I don't see us, in my eyes, taking action on this tonight. I see it being another good discussion and us being able to make changes appropriately and then bringing those forward at a later time. So with that, I guess I'll turn it over to Mr. Sanders, and we'll start talking.
Thanks, Aaron. So I think the first part that we want to focus on, and maybe a revisit, is the sign issue. So you bring up that document, and we'll start with that. I alluded to something in previous meetings regarding content neutrality and sign regulations, and I happen to be working on a couple other zoning ordinances at the moment, and working with a couple town attorneys that I work with, pardon the redundancy. And we're going back and forth on how to address some of these issues. You know, what does content neutrality mean from the perspective of the Supreme Court ruling? And it's a little bit complicated because Justice Scalia, before he passed, ruled on this, and his ruling was separate from the majority opinion, but it carries a bunch of legal weight for reasons that are probably more complicated than I can explain or understand. So what I did following our last meeting is take another pass through the draft zoning ordinance on the sign regulations to see what I missed, what I can improve on. As I mentioned to Aaron a few minutes ago, I don't think that's going to be the last time I do that. I've run through this a couple times. Again, I'm using similar language with the zoning ordinance for another client, bouncing it off an attorney I work with and respect. And I think we might see a few more changes coming. So this, to a degree that I probably am not completely comfortable with, is still a work in progress. Now, in addition, I know that there are some issues that popped up recently with respect to signs. Landowners, business owners concerned that the existing regulations are restrictive or prohibitive. So we may be catching some feedback on that at some point in the near future if it's not going to come up tonight. So with that in mind, by all means, please jump in and stop me if you have any questions. But the guts of it is covered in that first paragraph up at the top. It's Reed versus Town of Gilbert. And basically what we have to do with respect to a sign ordinance is ask a simple question. And that is, if any aspect of the regulation in any respect is content focused, it violates the United States Constitution. It violates the First Amendment. So the best example of something that seems innocuous but isn't is a directional sign. So if we call something a directional sign, we are not referring to the sign's location, shape, size, setback, zoning district, or anything else. We're actually referring to the content, because the content of the sign, meaning a directional sign, is to direct people. And that's the one. This is the sign that led to this increased focus on my end on the language I prepared and presented last time. So looking at the current ordinance versus the rewrite, the content-based regulations that I removed subsequent to our last meeting from Chapter 17 are construction signs. Well, you see them. So I guess what I would like to do before I keep talking is get your thoughts on, or any comments you have regarding those 7 signs that I'm proposing to remove. And perhaps if you have questions, I can explain why they're problematic. Or I could just keep trucking along through the rewrite. I'll defer to those of you in the room, so to speak. Hearing none, probably.
Jeff, let me ask one then. Just hit on the real estate sign and why you think that should just be considered a temporary sign now.
Good question, Mr. Mayor. So the problem with the real estate sign is its content. It's not content neutral. It's a sign specific to the sale or the lease or something like that of a piece of property. And a strict interpretation of the Reed ruling is that sign ordinances in the United States can no longer do that. So real estate signs in the current ordinance and in most ordinance were in effect temporary signs. In other words, you could not put a for sale sign up in front of, I could not put a for sale sign up in front of my house and leave it there forever. It could be there while my house is for sale. And then at some point after my house is sold, that for sale sign would be removed. So it's not a permanent sign by its nature, it's a temporary sign. Now, a temporary sign doesn't bump into this Reed ruling because it's not about the content, it's about the duration that the sign is up. Maybe a better example, or maybe another applicable example, would be campaign and election signs. So Wisconsin has a law specific to the time period within which campaign signs can be put up. You know, X number of days before the campaign period, the sign can go up, and then a certain number of days after the campaign period, the sign has to come down. Each of the three attorneys I've talked to on this said that violates the Reed decision. So Wisconsin hasn't yet got around to revising that rule. So for the time being, I think when it comes to political signs, probably best to just leave them alone. But whether it be construction signs, project or identification signs, real estate signs, or any of the other ones you see over there, they're all by their very definition a content-oriented sign. So what I was trying to find is an alternative to them, and certainly with construction, project, real estate, the temporary sign option became the most valuable or most viable. So then we get into the regulation of temporary signs, and again, we'll probably bump into a little bit later where I have the language regarding temporary signs in here, but it's the only option that I believe is compatible with Reed decision. So as always, I apologize for my long-winded response. You're probably going to get more of that tonight than you would in the past, because I'm going to struggle a little bit with trying to explain the nature of these changes with respect to the Supreme Court's ruling.
Can I ask you a question, Jeff?
By all means.
You have number 6 as memorial signs, and then over, of course, it talks about memorial signs, what they are and what can be on them. But what about those signs that are placed up in alongside roads in which there was an accident and maybe a fatality, and somebody puts up a sign across? Those seem to stay up for long periods of time, and I don't know where they would fall. Sometimes that is within the city limits.
Yes, sir. So this is a generalization, but the vast majority, if not all of those signs, are illegal signs, right? They're signs that are put up in violation of existing sign regulations, if sign regulations exist. I do know that there are communities in Wisconsin that actually remove them as soon as they're put up. Most communities kind of, don't ask, don't tell when it comes to those signs. From a purely legal standpoint, any of those such signs in the city of Waupaca would be in violation of your current ordinance and would be in violation of this ordinance in front of you if it were adopted tonight. Now, could the city create some mechanism through which that would be allowable? Potentially, but first of all, it's an off-premises sign, and the city prohibits those. We'd probably have to create a specific exclusion for them, but they're inherently content-oriented signs. So I'm not sure. I don't think it would be difficult to create the means by which we could allow them, But in so doing, we would create the means by which someone could do any kind of sign that met whatever let me give you an example. Obviously we can't regulate a sign based upon a symbol, whether it be a cross or a Star of David or a crescent or anything of that ilk. So we could regulate the height potentially, but since we can't regulate content, it would mean that in theory, anybody, any business, any organization could start plastering the city with these signs. You could, I suppose, in theory, say that one sign allowed per, it's not even person or entity, but since they're off-premises signs, by their very nature, they're located where some tragedy happened. It's an excellent question. I will say that I'll run it by some people whose opinion matters to me. I suspect I'm going to get the same answer from them that I've got in the past, because this issue has popped up in the past, and that is we just don't think about it, we don't consider it, and we ignore them. Other than the communities that actively remove them when they're put up. And there are a growing number of those in Wisconsin. Now, DOT removes them within their rights of way whenever they find them.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So if you notice on number 7 on the right-hand column, signs intended to protect public safety or warn of potential hazards associated with specific activity. That gets close to what the current ordinance says. So let me back up. So the current zoning ordinance prohibits directional signs by omission, meaning they're not listed as a structure or permitted sign, allowable sign in any district, so therefore they're prohibited. However, the city has had a policy in the past that's not supported within the zoning ordinance to allow 2 signs, one associated with ingress, one associated with egress, with a prohibition against any sort of advertising on the sign. So basically, when you think of the typical fast food restaurant, there's a sign that says enter here and a different sign that says exit here. The policy that the city of Waupaca has used in the past said you could have 2 of those. They could be, if I remember right, no taller than 3 feet in height. And I want to say it was 2 square feet in area, 1 square foot on each side of the face. So if you had a sign that had enter here on each side of it, that sign could be no larger than 1 square foot. I might be wrong in that it's possible it could be 2 square feet. Anyways, the point is, the sign actually isn't allowable in the ordinance, but the city had a policy to allow those. What I'm suggesting is that we have a blanket policy that says any sign that is intended to protect safety or warn against hazards is a permitted sign. And the bar would be if somebody comes in and says, well, yeah, I need these for safety, the zoning administrator and indirectly the city administrator, plan commission, city council could say, no, that's not true. We can't regulate the marketing aspect of it. We can't say you can't put a McDonald's logo on this sign because, again, that's content. But we can limit the number to 2, one specifically associated with an ingress, one specifically associated with an egress. Is that relatively clear?
I think so.
Any other questions on this first page before we move on? Actually, I should say the next section below that last row on the bottom, the current ordinance doesn't have a purpose for sign regulations. It's problematic because the direction that the state of Wisconsin has been going is regulations that are built into a zoning ordinance or any other ordinance have to be grounded in a purpose that is stated in the ordinance and supported by a comprehensive plan when it comes to a zoning ordinance and land division, subdivision ordinance. So we'll see sections 17.501 and 17.504. And Aaron, I'm not sure if you want to bring those up while we do this or not. It might be a little bit burdensome to jump back and forth. I'll defer to you on that. But I can give you a quick summary of that. Forgive me, I'm using multiple monitors here, so I apologize when I turn my head, my audio might be affected. So the main sections in the purpose are that the chapter will establish a reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions and shall not establish or enforce content-based restrictions. And the second part, 17.502, is that signs containing non-commercial speech are permitted anywhere that signs containing commercial speech are permitted. So basically, if the city allows a sign that says, eat at Joe's Diner, we can't prohibit a sign that a similar sign that doesn't have a commercial message. Like, I don't know what the example it would be, but we're going to get to that when we discuss murals. Any questions on that part? Probably not, I guess, but just make sure. So in the current ordinance, real estate signs, name, occupation, and warning signs, bulletin boards, memorial signs, and official signs do not require a permit. In the amended ordinance, they also don't require a permit because they're temporary. I take that back. Let me navigate my way to 17.506 quickly. So signs not requiring a permit in non-residential districts would be 2 temporary signs, and in residential districts, 1 temporary sign. So again, in the R1, R2, and R3 district, anybody could put up a for sale sign or a for lease sign without having to apply for a sign permit. Now, they'd still have to comply with all the regulations for signs, setbacks, heights, and all that kind of stuff, but it would not require a permit. Same is true in the non-residential districts. However, in that district, we have allowance for 2 signs. And then if we scroll down to all districts, we'll see that rather extensive list of signs that do not require a permit. And again, I've gone through this over and over again, trying to make sure that we're meeting the content neutrality requirements of the Reed decision. I'll be revisiting it again as I continue along this process. And the existing ordinance, with respect to construction standards and maintenance standards, there are none provided. Basically, the ordinance has to defer to the building code, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but many building codes aren't set up to handle sign issues. They deal with signs as structures, whereas the standards that would be in the sign ordinance would be specific to signs. In terms of measurement standards, they're addressed in the current ordinance, but not clearly. So you have to kind of navigate through a couple different sections to find out exactly how a sign is measured, whether it be a wall sign or a freestanding sign and such. So what we're doing in section 17.509.3, Aaron, if you'd move there, is establishing the specific standards for measurement. Now, in the version that Aaron brings up, I'm hoping there's going to be a bunch of red writing there, because if it isn't, I sent you the wrong one. There we go. So this section, in terms of signable area, is specific to wall signs, and this language will remain, forgive the typo, this language, this paragraph sub A, will remain if the Plan Commission, the City Council, choose to stick with the wall sign maximum area being associated with the size of the wall. My recommendation is we transition away from that and we move to the lineal foot, the width of the street frontage in lineal feet. But we'll get to that in a moment. So the red language that you see before you, that stays. If you want to stick closer to what we do now, it would be removed if we go with a sign based upon road frontage. But the most important part here is the measuring sign face and measuring sign height. The question that I've had with the last handful of sign permits I've reviewed was how do we measure the sign? For instance, if a sign is inside a box, are we measuring the box or are we just measuring the sign? And the current ordinance doesn't specify that. So we want to make sure what parts of the structure are measurable face and which parts are supporting. Is that clear? Illumination standards. There are none within the current ordinance. The two most common built into most zoning, and this is other than, this doesn't get into the specifics of whether the lighting is incandescent LED or something like that when it comes to internal. The big thing is we want to make sure, the main thing we want to make sure of is that we don't have exposed bulbs strung on poles and that sort of thing. And then the other part is to make sure whatever the lighting is associated with the sign. It illuminates the sign. It doesn't cause glare on roads. It doesn't spill over onto adjoining properties and the like. In terms of landscape standards, in the current ordinance, there's some associated with directionals and quite a bit more associated with the interchange zone district. What I'm recommending is that we actually have landscape standards for all ground signs, or in the current ordinance, they're referred to as freestanding signs, but they're kind of synonyms. And then that the species itself, the species themselves and the landscaping will be consistent with the proposed landscape element of this rewritten chapter.
Jeff, this is Alan. May I go back to lighting for a moment?
Absolutely.
Did you give any thought to having only downward lighting for illuminating signs?
That's basically what sub B does without saying it has to point down. So what I'm trying to say is lighting has to be, the shielded and hooded part is to make sure that the lighting is illuminating the sign and nothing else. And then the rest of it is to further that by saying it can't point up, it can't point out, it can't distract drivers, and it can't spill over onto adjoining properties. So I think the combination of the wording that you see in sub B, which isn't, I should say this is not my language, it's language that, I'd love to take credit for it, but it's language I've taken out of other ordinances. It's been vetted over time to ensure that it does what we want it to do, which is, again, light the sign, not anything else. Does that adequately answer your question, Alan?
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. So if we look at the last two rows, right now, the way we determine the maximum allowable size for a wall sign is to calculate the size of the wall. And then whatever that square footage is of the wall, it's 3% of that total is the maximum allowable wall sign for a sign in the B1 district and 5% for the other business and industrial districts. The problem that I bumped into with trying to administer this part of the ordinance is the ordinance doesn't actually define what a wall is. For instance, most zoning ordinances that are based upon the wall actually use the term facade. And the reason is facade includes walls, windows, doors, right? Any architectural accoutrements or elements, parapets and such. It's what I think most of us in this room would think of when we say the wall of a building. But when you use the word wall, those ordinances that do use the term walls tend to almost exclusively exclude windows and doors, because windows and doors are not walls. So if the wishes or the will of the Plan Commission and the City Council is to not go this route to where we're using street frontage to determine maximum sign, what I would suggest is we eliminate the term, we eliminate the word wall as a measurement and use facade. That way you don't have to have somebody out there with a tape measure going the length of the facade and the height of the facade and then measuring out every single window and every single door and subtracting that. It's unnecessarily burdensome for everybody involved. I'm not confident that whatever benefit was intended from that process is actually a benefit accrued from that process. Whereas if you go to the right column now and you look at the language that most ordinances have transitioned to, just about every wall sign regulation that I bumped into in my career at one point was very similar to what Waupaca is right now. It was a wall is this big, and then you can have a sign on it that is some percentage of that wall. Those that didn't go that route just had a fixed standard. Wall signs could be no larger than, X number of square feet, and left it at that. What we're seeing now is it's related to street frontage with a cap. Now, the question I would have for the Plan Commission, of course, is whether the cap is acceptable. Right now, in theory, if you have a very, very large wall, you could have a wall sign that potentially greatly exceeds 500 square feet in size. And just to, for a planner like myself who has limited math skills, I defer to engineers like Justin for that. A 500 square foot sign is 10 feet by 50 feet. And that's a pretty good sized sign, right? So I know that we have a landowner right now who has been communicating with, property owner has been communicating with Mayor Smith, Aaron, and I regarding this issue, and I'm going to be very curious to see whether the transition from 3% or 5% of wall area to 1 square foot of face area per lineal foot of street frontage will be viewed by him as less restrictive and more beneficial or not. But the question I would ask right now again is whether or not the Plan Commission is comfortable with 500 square feet area. That's the kind of the median right now in wall sign regulation. It could be smaller, it could be larger. And if you don't mind, I'm going to defer on the mural issue until we get a little bit farther along in this discussion. Any thoughts or questions?
So Jeff, I'm not a commissioner, obviously, but I have a question on this. I think it'd be helpful to have, we talked about this a little bit. And we talked about the challenges, I think at the last meeting, just to jog everyone's memory, we talked about the challenges of trying to calculate 3 or 5% or any percentage by when you take out windows and doors and things like that. It's hard enough to get people to calculate 3 or 5% on just the sheer surface area of the wall, including those things, which is why we looked at the 1 square foot of face area per lineal foot of street frontage, which is pretty easy to figure out. It'd be nice to, maybe we could bring back a couple examples of, just pick a handful of buildings that are different. One on Main Street, that's a more narrow, taller building with a narrow, linear foot area. And then maybe the Chamber building, which is a whole different scenario. That might help give commissioners an idea of what that means and how big can those signs actually be. Does that make sense?
Absolutely does. And we could probably do that relatively quickly right now if you have access to the staff report.
Well, here's my problem. This is another thing I want to say. I don't know if you guys can see. I'm at City Hall running this meeting right now, and the screen has gone black on me 2 or 3 times, and it says poor network quality. This hasn't really happened here at the office, so if I lose you, that's why. I might also turn my camera off, as sometimes not streaming video will help. But you want me to try to pull up a staff report?
Well, I guess it's up to the Plan Commission. If we suspect that we're going to need another meeting, we could certainly forego that now, and I could bring a real world comparison of a permit that was either approved or denied under the current regulations, and then compare it to what would or could be allowable under the proposed rewrite.
Aaron,
Yeah.
Aaron, just a thought. Maybe if we were to choose a wall, you could use the same one that they're thinking about using for the mural, the old JR's Hardware building, because that would give an idea of how big of a sign, even if they didn't move forward, whether it's a commercial sign or an artistic sign, could use that wall.
Yeah, we could do that. We could use that as one of the examples. I do think if it's art and it's not under the sign definition, that it can be technically as large as you want it to be. Am I saying that right, Jeff?
What you said was right grammatically, just wrong legally.
All right. Well, I'll let you explain the difference there, but.
Yeah, we cannot regulate between commercial and non-commercial uses anymore. So whatever standards, if the city of Waupaca wants a mural, allow a mural, we have to allow commercial signs of the same size. That's the short that's the short version of it. We cannot differentiate between commercial and non-commercial speech because that is content-based. So if we want to allow murals, let's say, we have a building that's, 75 feet long and 20 feet tall, and we want to allow the entire facade of that structure to be painted with some sort of mural, we have to also allow that same exact structure to be painted with a commercial sign.
Really? That's interesting.
That's part of the reason I've been going through this quite a bit now.
Okay.
The ruling is pretty clear that you cannot differentiate between commercial and non-commercial speech. So it's not about art. Art is a protected expression of the First Amendment, as is commercial speech.
Okay. Well, I think we can bring a couple examples back, and I think just to Jeff's point of, do we think we're going to have another meeting? I think we are. Again, it's ultimately your guys' decision, and I think we also can cover some of this in a regular meeting and see where we get from there. But I think we can definitely I'll make a note to bring some examples back of this to give you a better idea visually of what that could look like on different types of buildings. Is everyone okay with that?
Sure. So can I ask Jeff? Oh, Jeff, according to what you just said, if a city has a large mural on a building, can you do anything to regulate from that point on, or you just have to accept whatever the person wants to put up, be it either mural or non-art or non-art?
Good question. If it's an existing mural, I'm going to use the word sign because really we can't differentiate between the two anymore. So if there's an existing sign on a structure that is non-compliant with either the current ordinance or the rewritten ordinance, that sign is legal non-conforming. It can be maintained over time. It cannot be enlarged. It cannot be removed and replaced with something else. So for instance, if we have one side of a building says enjoy Coca-Cola, that typical kind of 1940s red and white sign. If that sign exceeds whatever the maximum allowable area for a wall sign, it's legal non-conforming. It can be repainted. In other words, if it can be maintained. So if it's faded, it can be repainted, but it cannot be enlarged. That, what I just described, applies to any such sign, I don't even know how to use the word other than sign, but it applies to any such sign regardless of the message or lack of message that sign contains. So murals, if somebody painted a beautiful, a Pacific Island scene on the side of a building in the city of Waupaca, if that scene exceeds the allowable size of a wall sign right now, it's a non-conforming sign, and it can be maintained, but it cannot be replaced. If they were to paint over it if the individual was to paint over it with a mountain scene, that would be in violation of the zoning ordinance, the sign regulations. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. On this subject, I'm pretty comfortable addressing the answers because it's really unequivocal. We cannot regulate art any different than we would regulate signs. Now, when I say art, I'm talking about artwork that would be synonymous with a sign in terms of its structure, its makeup, its everything other than message, because again, we can't regulate message anymore. Any other thoughts on all wall signs, or should we bump down to awnings and canopies? So right now, under the current ordinance, awnings and canopy signs are prohibited by omission, meaning it doesn't specifically say that you can have an awning sign or a canopy sign, therefore it's prohibited. However, there are these two references to awnings and signs that make it a bit problematic. One is in the actual sign guide, where there's language that says clearance between the grade at sidewalk, any point, lowest point, etc. So we're referencing something called a canopy and an awning within something called a sign guide. Now, if the city allows awnings or canopies, but prohibits signs on awnings and canopies, then we don't want awnings and canopies to appear in the sign guide. And then the final thing is the actual canopy and awning guide includes multiple references to signs. So the combination of the reference to the signs and the fact that those terms, canopy and awning, exist within the sign guide is kind of a problem, right? We don't identify any districts within which a canopy sign or an awning sign is allowed, therefore they're prohibited. But we have an application guide that implies that they're allowable. So what I'm suggesting is we just make them a permitted sign within the business and industrial districts. We define them accordingly, and they would be regulated in terms of their size, as we'll see later on when we go through this document. Is everybody comfortable with that?
I am.
Aaron, for the next one on multi-tenant signs, could you actually bring up the draft language? So it would be 17.5.10. All right, so sub 6, it's going to be on the bottom of or top of page 80. There you go. Thank you. So everybody, just multi-tenant signs are, when you think of a strip mall or some other commercial complex, it's that rather large, usually rather large, tall ground-mounted sign that includes multiple sign structure. I'm sorry, that includes multiple signs on it. So it may say, Bed Bath and Beyond and Best Buy and Pets R Us and whatever the case may be. The challenge that we have in the current ordinance is multi-tenant signs aren't allowed at all. So again, we're in that prohibited by omission element. Clearly, we have multi-tenant signs all over the city. We've been regulating them under the sign ordinance, but we've been doing it in kind of an ad hoc manner based on what's happened in the past. None of which makes me comfortable from a legal standpoint. So what I'm proposing to do is actually build in protections for those existing signs by creating this structure called a multi-tenant sign. So you see the language that Aaron has up for us right now. And that is language that I took out of another ordinance and seemed to me to achieve the goals that we're looking for. So we identified the districts, we identify the standards, the general standards for these things. So they can be ground signs, meaning, monument signs that essentially do not sit on a pole but rest on the ground itself, or they can be a freestanding sign, which would be a sign that rests on a pole or poles. We have dimensional standards for the maximum number of signs allowed in a single development. So you can't have multiple tenant signs in a commercial, strip commercial or mall setting. We also have a maximum number of tenant panels. There can't be multiple signs for a single business. It's basically, if you have a strip mall that has 5 units in it, the maximum number of signs on that tenant structure is 5. So you go through the basics here. The one that is important for us to include, I think, is sub F down at the bottom. And that's for a variety of reasons. The most important thing is it actually protects the landowner. What I've bumped into in the past in some communities with these multi-tenant signs is I'm sorry, not the landowner, the business owner. The business owner will have a squabble with the tenant that ends up manifesting itself in the removal of signs or limiting how much area this business has compared to that business when it comes to sign face. An easement basically says, if I occupy this unit in this structure, I'm allowed the applicable amount of signage for my business on the tenant sign. So it is an easement. It does get registered. It's a complicated. I think if some of the owners of tenant signs in the community I shouldn't say anything. I suspect they will balk at the additional requirement here, and it's certainly something that the Plan Commission and City Council are going to want to weigh heavily. But it does provide the greatest amount of protection to all parties involved, including the city for that matter. Any thoughts on the tenant sign issue? If not, so there's no indemnification section in the sign ordinance. There is within the zoning ordinance itself, but given the First Amendment implications of signs, it's always good to have something specific for that section and regarding indemnification. So you can read the language in the right column. In terms of bonds, insurance, sureties, and insurance, what the city of Waupaca has right now is quite a bit more stringent than the norm. It actually requires, quite a bit more upfront for a sign for sign installer for sign owners than most communities do. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if the city is comfortable with those requirements, if they're not broke, there's no need to fix it. The standard in the right side is much more common, where you're basically requiring that the business provides a certificate of insurance. And if they can provide that, saying that they're insured up to whatever the maximum amount is, all the rest of this stuff is not really required. It seems to me to be just a little bit burdensome, or maybe a lot bit burdensome. And if you want to scroll down to removal and disposition of signs, just kind of clarifies the parties involved in addressing, remediating, and if necessary, causing the removal of signs that are dilapidated and abandoned and unlawful. And if you scroll down again, Aaron, the current zoning ordinance does not include any reference to nonconformities for signs. It deals with nonconformities in the nonconformity section for uses and structures. The challenge there, and again, Aaron, if you don't mind going to 17. What? Hold on here. Apologies. There we go. 17.514, not 15.514. Signs are a structure, but the language for non-conforming structures in the current ordinance and in the revised ordinance, for that matter, are not specific enough to signs. So this just makes it much, much clearer. We want to make sure that, again, if somebody has a mural or a wall sign that's painted on, that they have the legal right to maintain that sign, including repainting it consistent with the existing sign. They can't paint it with a different message or a different image or anything along those lines if it's not conforming. But we just want to make sure that that language is specifically stated within the ordinance. It's not right now. And Eric, if you want to scroll down to the next. This one's going to be a little bit tougher. I was trying to find a way to do a side-by-side comparison of existing sign requirements in terms of sizing and location and stuff with the proposed, and it just wasn't working well. It seemed to get a little bit too busy. So we may have to flip back and forth, both online and in your packet. But the existing sign requirements are in the table that you see before you. And then the next page would be the rewrites. So I broke out the districts by commonality. What I mean by that is the B1, I1, I2, and PUL, Public Utilities District, have the same regulations or very, very similar regulations with respect to ground signs, projecting signs, and wall signs. So I combined those together. And then if you scroll further, it's going to be farther, the B2, B3, B4, and B5 districts have essentially the same exact standards. B6 is a little bit different because, again, the interchange district has, it almost exists as its own ordinance within an ordinance, or its own sign regulations within the sign regulations. So that one's broken out. And then B7 is the Waterfront District. And again, the uniqueness of that area, I guess, necessitates, or certainly requests a slightly different sign ordinance than what we have in the other districts. So not sure how to engage in this discussion, other than to say, and maybe Aaron, if we could go to the B2, B3, B4, B5 new district section, it'd probably be the easiest. So awning and canopy signs, I'm recommending one per street facing first floor window. So if they have windows on the sides, they could have canopies and awnings there, but they could not have signs on them. It could not have writing on them or anything constituting a sign. You see the maximum areas, maximum height, street yard setback are all in the tables below. I'm replacing the freestanding classification for signs with a ground sign, because again, a ground sign, it's kind of all toads are frogs, all frogs aren't toads, or all moths are butterflies, all butterflies aren't moths. All pole signs and all freestanding signs are ground signs, but not all ground signs are pole signs and freestanding. I probably said that wrong. That probably didn't help at all. Why don't you just, Aaron, rewind that and then erase it, and we'll go from there. Ground sign is the most commonly used term for the types of signs that are built into the ground, whether it be a pole ground sign, a freestanding ground sign, or a monument sign. Is that a little bit clearer? I hope. Right now, the sign ordinance does not allow for portable signs. The best example of that in business districts is that typical sandwich sign that restaurants often have. It's the thing that looks a little bit like a pup tent that you put out in front that says, today's special, or if it's a barber shop, 2 cuts for the price of 1, whatever the case may be. Projecting signs are regulated in the current ordinance. I'm not recommending any changes to those. A non-residential wall sign, I'm not changing the maximum number, which currently is 3. We've already talked quite a bit in terms of how the measurements would occur. And then also adding something called window door signs. So right now, any business that puts a sign in their window is actually violating the zoning ordinance. And I'm confident that that isn't the intent of the city council and the plan commission. So if a business does have signs in its windows or on their doors, whether they be painted or affixed, those signs have to abide by the most closely associated sign, which would be a wall sign. Again, if an ordinance classifies a wall sign, allows a wall sign to include windows and doors, then any sign in a window and door must be a wall sign. But what we have in the community are wall signs, businesses with wall signs and with window and door signs that quite likely in some cases, if not many cases, violate the maximum allowable area. What I'm saying is let's separate those out and allow for one window sign or one door sign that is 25% of the window or door area, so that a restaurant or a curio shop or a law office or whatever the case may be can have that sign that's so common and ubiquitous in established older communities without being in violation of the zoning ordinance.
I raised the question about a barber shop who has an open sign and an hours of operation sign. You couldn't have 2 signs then?
Great question. Those are actually not considered signs. I wish I could give you a really good reason why, but I've confirmed that those open, closed hours of operation are not considered signs under any sign ordinance that I've ever seen. Signs like 20% off sale, those things aren't considered signs.
How about realtors who put listings up on their windows, Jeff?
That probably would have to comply with sign regulations. I would have to put a little bit more thought into it, but I think there's a line that is crossed there, and it would probably take me a little bit of time to explain it. I'd have to be confident that I have a good explanation for it, but I'm pretty sure that that would cross the line.
So, I guess just I bring that up because I think that's something I see, if I ever travel anywhere, walking down a main street, I think it's pretty common to see full windows kind of caked in those things. And I guess it'd be a good discussion for maybe Plan Commission to weigh in on if they think that's okay or not okay or what. The other question I would have too with windows and door signs is, sometimes they'll stick a big window sign up for a temporary cause, a grand opening or something. I think that actually just happened around here as well. And it's more than 25%, but what if it's only meant to be up for a couple weeks? That would be fall under temporary signage or what?
Right. So it would be protected as a temporary sign if it complies with the requirements for a temporary sign in the code. And I'm just going to go there quickly. So a temporary sign is defined as a sign which may be displayed for a limited period of time. And then we go back to section 17506 sub 2, where you can have 2 temporary signs. No sign shall exceed 32 square feet in total face area. Sign shall not be located in any public right of way. There shall not be artificially illuminated. Shall not be erected more than 15 days before and shall be removed no later than 5 days after the event, activity, or purpose for which the sign is intended. In no case shall signs be maintained for more than 60 days other than specifically allowed under Chapter 12.04 WISTATS. That's Wisconsin's campaign sign laws. So the sign that you described, Aaron, would be covered under that. And if it exists for a period of time outside of the allowable time, it would be in violation.
And if it exists within the allowed amount of time, but it's over 25% of the window, is that still okay? No. So if the sign is, a window sign or a door sign is a sign that is affixed to the window, right? If there's a sign inside the store that is visible through the window but is not affixed to the window, that does not fall under this definition. And typically the main reason, can you please explain the main reason that we would only want it 25% instead of say 50, 75%? Is it because of security reasons? And I've heard that, some arguments in communities are police want us to be able to see in the windows. Are there other types of things? Well, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure thing, and let me immediately retract my previous response. So window sign is defined as a sign that is applied or attached to the exterior or interior of a window or located in such manner within the building that it can be readily seen from the exterior of the building through a window. So I retract what I said earlier. If it was a sign kind of in that that sales area of a retail shop that was visible, it would have to comply with those requirements as well. In response to your question, yes, it's generally a public safety visibility issue. It's why that doesn't mean that it can't be larger, but that's the reason you typically have prohibitions against an entire window being covered in signs, so that it precludes the ability to see into the structure from outside the structure.
And so my next question is what if someone has blinds or something that are closed in a window and you can't see in? I mean, what's the difference?
That's an excellent question. I suppose it's the transient nature of the latter, but I'm not sure. I don't know that any ordinance has the ability to regulate that. I guess the interesting question would be what if the blinds had a sign on it, right? Where you close the sign and you close the blinds, and through the mechanism of closing the blinds, a sign appears, and you open them and it disappears. That would certainly qualify as a sign. It would be regulated. Blinds are not, but I'd have to do a little exploration and to give you a better answer. Any answer would probably be better than what I give, but that's about the best I can provide right now.
Yeah, and it just seems, and the only reason I ask these questions, Jeff, is because it seems like most of the complaints we get are because when we are ever criticized for being too restrictive, it's almost always towards the size of signs, it seems like.
Yep.
You know, and why can't I have a sign that's this big or whatever?
Sure.
And I just want to make sure I understand what we're comfortable with. And, you know, I guess maybe this is something we should get law enforcement's opinion on too. Do they care, you know, if it's 50% or 75% or whatever it may be? I don't know. I mean, I just foresee that one being questioned in the future.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. And I can say in quite a few respects, the city of Waupaca's current sign regulations are objectively more stringent than most. And that may be for good reason, right? What I haven't been doing is recommending wholesale changes to the existing regulations. I'm trying to deal with the problems that I've noticed from a legal defensibility standpoint, from an administration standpoint, and from the feedback that I've received from the various parties who've been involved in the sign application review and approval process during my tenure. But some of these requirements are more stringent. Some are, you know, closer to the mean.
So when we talk about the ones that are more stringent, I think it'd probably be helpful to highlight the ones that are more stringent and say, you know, what would be more of a norm, and are we okay going to that?
Sure. So yeah, in general, it's the square footage limitations. I can tell you the one area that the city is far more lenient than most is allowing for up to 3 wall signs for a structure. Most communities cap it at 1. Some 2. There aren't that many that allow 3 anymore. So in that respect, you know, I've had pushback on 2 occasions in the last couple of months from businesses that wanted to have considerably more than 3, 4 and 5, and their argument was, you know, I've heard, you know, this is the strictest sign ordinance we've ever had to deal with, and at least with respect to wall signs, I would disagree with that. But go ahead. Sorry.
I didn't say anything. Sorry.
Oh, I thought it. So yeah, in terms of specifics, the maximum height for ground signs of 20 feet is around the norm, maybe even a little bit more flexible than most. In interior, in central business districts and things like that, tend to be quite a bit shorter than 20 feet. Many communities are transitioning to monument signs, projecting signs exclusively, not allowing ground signs and pole signs anymore. Not the kind of pole signs that are currently allowable in the city of Waupaca. But I think it's mainly the limits on the size of wall signs that are the biggest pushback that I've had. And that's, again, that 5%, 10%, 3%, 5% of wall area.
So, okay.
And it's not so much the regulations themselves, it's the process. I think that I believe it's accurate to say that a number of the individuals who complained about the sign regulations were really complaining about the process, the lack of clarity in the applications, the lack of clarity in the review and approval process. And that's something that I recognized when I did the audit, you know, a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Okay, I'm going to go back, and I know we're already an hour into the meeting and we haven't got off of signs yet, but I want to go back. I just want to make sure we have a conversation on this. When we talk about the 5% possibly being too restrictive on wall signs, and now we're talking about going to a linear square foot based off linear footage of your property, which could kind of be all over the place. In some instances, it might be less restrictive. In some instances, it might be more restrictive. What's the, is there a conversation to be had to, instead of going that direction, just go to 7% or 8%? I'm not sure what the right number is, but let's say 8% of the surface area on that wall and define it so it encompasses doors and windows like it always has. What's the reason we wouldn't want to do that, or is there not a reason?
The main reason that, well, there's right. The main reason that comes to mind where you don't want to, where you would, how do I say this? If the city of Waupaca is interested in allowing for murals, the existing sign regulations are prohibitive. Basically, all you could have is small murals. If the possibility of having a mural, knowing that you'd then have to allow a rather large commercial sign, is something the city wants, we have to transition away from this percentage of the wall thing, unless the percentage of the wall thing would be 50% or 75% or something else. I think it's the combination of setting a maximum, and again, it could be 500 square feet, it could be another number. I'll defer to those of you in the meeting to determine where that number is best suited for Waupaca. But the lineal foot gives you something. Let me approach it a different way, Aaron, sorry. It is unlikely that you can have a structure that sits on a parcel that is 50 feet wide that has a wall that is 60 feet wide, right? I mean, the wall itself, the facade that faces the street, is going to be the limiting factor in determining how big that wall sign is. Now, right now, you have the possibility of up to 3 wall signs located wherever they're located, as long as they comply with the wall area requirements of the wall upon which or to which that sign is attached. So you could have 3 wall signs on the front of a building as long as the aggregate total of those 3 signs did not exceed the 3% or the 5% rule. Or you could have 1 sign on each of 3 sides of the structure, and that each of those signs could be considerably larger, right? As long as the sign doesn't exceed the 3% or 5% threshold. What the linear footage does is, and I'd be more comfortable if I had actually done this for the meeting. I apologize for not. If I had had a good example to show you. So we'll certainly be doing that next week. But we have one landowner who has asked whether or not the proposed regulations regarding wall signs are more or less stringent than the existing regulations. And I couldn't say with certainty, but I suspect they're going to be more flexible, less stringent. Because 100 square feet of road frontage would allow for 100 square foot sign. 100 lineal feet of road frontage would allow for 100 square foot wall sign. Whereas I don't think there's any building on 100 lineal foot lot in the city of Waupaca that could put up 100 square foot sign right now. I don't think the math would work for the 5%. It would have to be a relatively tall, probably a prohibitively tall structure in order to do that. So short answer is I'm pretty sure this is going to be more flexible and more accommodating, but it also will allow for considerably larger size signs than is allowable now.
Okay.
I think the example will help, using a case study comparison of whether it be the chamber or some of the other sign permits that we've recently issued. I think it would be pretty helpful to do that, to show the Plan Commission that.
Yeah, I agree.
With a little bit more foresight, I would have thought of that before. Sorry about that.
All right.
So I'm just scrolling to the back end of the sign section to make sure I didn't miss anything that needs to be discussed. I think that's it. Obviously, whatever questions remain, let's address those, but I don't think I have anything else for signs. You might want to consider Aaron's comments regarding the percent of window and door area, whether we want that to be larger. What we could do is turn it around. Instead of saying it can be no more than 25% of the window area, we could say something like no less than 30% of the window area needs to be uncovered or something along those lines, right? So instead of saying how big the sign can be, we'd say this is how much of the window or the door needs to be unencumbered or unobstructed by a sign.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a better way to approach it.
Make a note of that.
Was that a statement that you're going to do, or is it a statement that I'm doing?
I said I'll make a note of it. I'm just taking some notes. You and I we'll circle back.
Sounds good. Thanks, Aaron.
Yep.
I tend to talk better when I'm not taking notes. Not that I talk that well anyway, but.
All right. Let's see here. Do you want to move on to site plan review?
I do. And again, this one is one of the most significant changes to the actual ordinance. Right now, the site plan, I think I've alluded to this in the past, the site plan process in the current ordinance for everything other than the East Gateway District is procedural only. It doesn't provide applicants with, well, I'd say much information, but actually it provides them with almost no direction, almost no information, which is problematic, because then what we have is a developer that comes before the city with a proposal, and they present that proposal, and the proposal may be absolutely consistent with the existing ordinance, but they're getting pushback from staff and appointed officials saying, well, why didn't you do this? And, maybe we would really like to see some trees over there or more parking or whatever the case may be. And having worked with enough developers in my time, their response, although most would rarely say this, is, well, if that's what you want, why didn't you tell us that in the zoning ordinance? Why didn't you tell us that in the application? And I think that comment that comment has merit. So the question then becomes, what do we need to build into the City of Waupaca site plan review process that provides those applicants with all the information that they need so that they can prepare a proposal that comes before the Plan Commission. The Plan Commission says, yep, you did everything that we asked you to do, it's approved. Or you did not do what we asked you to do, you missed these three things, and go back and come back later. So that really is the rationale behind this significantly expanded site plan review process that you see before you, and that we'll kind of go over quickly here. And again, you'll notice the purpose intent issue. It's something that's important to help the city defend itself against any challenges regarding elements of site plan review process. If we can say that it's consistent with the purpose of site plan review is to ensure these things, then we can say that this requirement is consistent with that purpose, and it enhances the legal defensibility of the issue. Excuse me, as always, please jump in with any comments you have. Under the current ordinance, there are 3 conditions that trigger site plan review. Any new building, except for single-family, 2-family dwellings. Additions to any existing building that increase the square footage of 50% or more. Those 2 are pretty clear, right? If you're building a new building and it's not a single-family or 2-family dwelling, you need to go through site plan review. If you're adding on to an existing building and the addition increases the square footage by 50% or more, that requires a site plan review. The problem is the third one. So any addition or subtraction to an existing building which does not increase the square footage of the existing building by 50% or more, but which results in a substantial modification to the property as determined by the development director. It's a little bit harder to argue, how do I say this, to defend what substantial means, right? It's a more subjective term, which is fine as long as I and Aaron and the building inspectors and others maintain consistency over time. If somebody does challenge us, we can say, listen, this is the standard that we've used to make the determination of substantial modification over time, and it's the standard that we applied to your structure, therefore we're good. But that's not how it's worked. It's been, at least as I understand it, it's been far more subjective than that. The percentage issue is in and of itself problematic, because imagine the example. Let's say you have a 10,000 square foot pole barn, and the addition is 500 square feet, but the addition includes all kinds of complicated uses and machinery and facilities and all kinds of stuff. It's the percentage of the overall area represented by the addition does not accurately convey the change to the existing use of that structure, the change to that structure in and of itself. So again, I think transitioning away from that to something that's a little bit more legally defensible is going to help us. Another thing is we need to define what development and redevelopment mean. Those terms are not currently defined within the ordinance. The definitions you see on the right-hand column are pretty standard. They're written a little bit differently in some ordinances. These are the ones that I've used the most and are most comfortable with. But it basically says that any of these activities trigger a requirement for site plan review. Now, it's not about percentage and all that kind of stuff. It's saying if you have an existing structure and you're proposing to do any of the things that are defined as development or redevelopment, you have to go through site plan review. Aaron, would you mind scrolling down to submittal requirements and process of review? So the existing requirements, again, I mentioned they're mostly procedural. There's some stormwater and landscaping stuff in there, but not guidance or not guidance or direction. But there is this thing called the site plan review checklist, and it's pretty expansive. I remember going off my memory right now, I think it's 5 pages long, give or take. And it's just a table with a series of questions asking for checks and boxes. You know, was it provided? Was it not provided? Or was it not relevant? The problem is we can't, it's just legally, we can't create an application form that isn't substantially based in the actual ordinance. You know, when you think about it, the reason becomes pretty obvious, right? There are public information process, open meeting requirements, and public hearing requirements for any ordinance. You have to comply with Chapter 985 in terms of public hearing, 15-day notice has to be posted. You have to go through all these mechanisms to allow for the public to engage in the process of amending a zoning ordinance. And then off on the side after that's done, you just create application forms that make the ordinance more stringent, more restrictive than it was when it went through public hearing. That's not something that's just allowable. You just can't do that, right? So if we want the standards, if the Plan Commission and City Council are comfortable in general with the list of requirements that appear in the site plan review checklist, we need to codify it within the actual ordinance. I'm just going to stop every once in a while, so if anybody has comments or questions, they can jump in. Otherwise, as you've learned, I'll just keep talking.
So, Jeff, I have a question. So when we're talking about site plan permit and we're attaching it to a certain property and talk about amending the site plan permit as over time.
Sure.
How do we track? How do you propose we track that? How do we ensure that we, you know, does that get done in a software program like Munilogic? Does it get done? How does that work?
So, as Aaron knows, I think I have to qualify. I have to throw a caveat before I answer this. I have concerns and have had concerns and will always have concerns about the variety of digital and software tools available out there to aid local government in exactly what Aaron's alluding to. So this is not specific to Munilogic or Municode, but all of those similar things. The difficulty with those programs is once it's created, the tool exists, and anything that a local government wants to do regarding tracking, permitting, reviewing, all that kind of stuff, it has to be done in a way that's conforms to the requirements of the tool, even if that means doing it in a way that you don't really want to do, but that's the only way to do it because the tool doesn't allow you to do it otherwise. So I've learned a lot more about Munologic in the last couple of months, and I do think it's a very, very beneficial tool. But like all of these tools, it has some absolutely fundamental problems. And one of them is Munologic is built to accommodate building codes, uniform dwelling codes, commercial building codes, and such. That's what that tool is for. It does not accommodate zoning ordinance regulations very well, because zoning requirements and building code requirements are very, very different. They're interrelated. They bump into each other and work collaboratively, hopefully collaboratively together, but they're completely different in terms of their nature. So what Elizabeth Holsworth and I are learning as we kind of continue down this path is how to make this tool that we have work to fit the needs of the building code and the zoning ordinance. And it is an ongoing process. So with that in mind, let me try to answer your question, Aaron. First and foremost, if you're issuing a site plan, let me back up. What exists right now is not so much a permit being issued, but a decision being made. Would that be accurate? The Plan Commission approves a site plan, and then it's the minutes of that Plan Commission that detail the approval of the site plan. Would that be correct, or essentially correct?
Yeah, I would say that, and probably the file of the staff report or whatever that accompanied it. Yeah, I would say that's correct.
Packet, the document, right?
Yeah.
What a permit does, it's exactly the same reason that you issue a building permit, or a special use permit or a conditional use permit. It's a piece of paper, whether it be literal or whether it be hard copy or electronic, that says this permit has been issued to this location, and it includes all of these requirements, and there's a signature at the bottom, or a number of signatures, right? Typically it would be, it could be the Plan Commission chair, it could be the mayor, most often it'd be the city administrator, usually the zoning administrator, sometimes the clerk, and definitely the owner of the parcel or business. The moment that owner has that permit protects the owner as long as the owner stays compliant. It's one document that lays out all of the specific conditions and requirements for he or she to maintain that use, maintain that structure, maintain whatever it is. In the absence of that, there are all these documents and these processes that are maintained however they're maintained, well or not so well. They're the minutes from meetings that can be very, very informative depending upon who's taking those minutes, or less so, right? So the permit itself is arguably the most important part of the review process, because it's the part that says this is what has to be done, this is what can be done. If the city council and the Plan Commission agree with that concept, then we get to Aaron's question: how do you maintain that over time? And right now, what happens if we were to pick a business that's been in business for a while and has had sign permit applications and business and building permit applications and accessory structures and such, what Elizabeth would be able to do is go to Munologic and pop up that address, and she would have access to all the various permits and approvals that have been granted by the city of Waupaca since Munologic has been in place. And I suspect it won't take much for Elizabeth and I to figure out how to do that same thing with the site plan permit. What happens right now is every time a business a landowner comes before the city, and again, I'm getting my toes are getting a little close to the line here because I'm not as familiar with this process as Elizabeth would be if she were in the room right now. It seems to me that there are multiple, there are multiple permits that are issued over time that may or may not have any relationship to the other permits that have been issued. Whereas a site plan permit would include everything. It would include signs and buildings, it would include everything, and it would be amended over time, not added, not replaced. So we'd never be in a position where we would have to go through 3, 4, 5, or 6 different site plans that were approved over time to determine whether or not what this individual is doing or proposing to do is compliant or non-compliant. It would be one site plan permit that would be amended over time to reflect changes in use of the structures, changes of the property, changes in the structures on the property, etc. The process of tracking that is not going to be that difficult, again, because we're not creating multiple documents that have to be tracked over time. We're amending and updating one single document. Does that answer your question, Aaron?
I think so, and I'm just to finish up real quick. I think, so one thing we talked about in aiding doing that is creating like a GIS map of the whole city, being able to attach these types of things to each parcel on that GIS thing and map, make some layers. Rhonda can do that and almost keep basically a database through that GIS map that would attach anything that was ever done to that parcel throughout the history of time. And I think does that sound like that would be an effective way to...
For those of you who recall Blazing Saddles, I give that a rousing harumph. That's exactly the tool. It's a locally developed tool that does everything we want it to do, and we can change it at our leisure without having to contact some business in San Diego or Newark and ask them to recreate, redesign, rework their software package so that it'll do what we need it to do. Because the response that we got, the response that local government often gets in that situation is, we can't do it for you, we'd have to do it for everybody.
Yeah. Okay,
so
cool.
That's my concern. You can't see it right now. I don't even know where it went. Where did my sign go? Of course, I referenced something that I can't find. Anyway, somewhere in this mess of an office right now, there is a sign that says, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And my concern with a lot of these software packages is they become hammers. And if you don't have a nail, well, that's tough. It only works on nails. So. Yeah.
Okay.
That's about as subjective a comment as you'll hear from me. So in terms of the site plan, it's where are we now, Aaron? I think we're in so submittal requirements. Back up a little bit. My recommendation is it would include the submittal requirements would include the principles that guide the actual requirements. There would be building design standards, because that's different than site design, right? I mean, certainly Justin would attest to the fact, and Elizabeth and Jane would attest to the fact that building requirements are somewhat different than site. They're interrelated, absolutely, but they're a different set of standards. Site plan standards, specific prohibitions, and then the plan data requirements. And the combination of all those built in the ordinance ensures that as long as we have a good application form, and as long as we have good guides, adequate, informative, clearly understood guides, anybody who bumps into this process will know exactly the 7 or the 15 or the 23 steps necessary to get from application to approval. There'll be no need for that kind of, well, why didn't you do this? Or I didn't know that was required. It just lays that path out clearly. And for all of us, whether we're elected and appointed officials, staff, developers, contractors, and such, there's almost nothing that is more beneficial than having a very, very clear process. I will take a clear process and a bad ordinance over a great ordinance and a bad process any day, every day, period. So in terms of site plan review process, we're adding a little bit here, and I do that. Oh, no, I don't want to go too far. So I'm hesitant to suggest bringing up the actual ordinance, Aaron, because it's so extensive and it's not particularly conducive to a discussion. It's definitely conducive to a question and answer process with when the Plan Commission becomes more familiar with that section. So I would request, in preparation for our next meeting, that we have a pretty detailed discussion of the proposed site plan review process, which means I would respectfully ask all of you to kind of look it over, highlight the stuff that you like and you want more explanation, or perhaps you want expanded. Red pen, red line the stuff that you don't think is applicable or you believe it's too restrictive or too problematic. And then
Jeff, what page does it start on in your rewrite, and I can resend it?
to my document. It's on page 62. Excuse me one moment. Hey, guys, come on. Sorry about that.
All right. I don't know how it goes.
Yeah, my office is located close to the bathroom within which my 7-year-old daughter is currently taking a bath. So apologies for the acoustics that may arise. So the site plan review process you see here, and I guess we can scroll through it just to give an idea, but I would really ask that, I request that you look this over and really critically identify what you like and don't like for a more lengthy discussion next time. Unless you've already done so, and certainly if you've looked it over and you have questions, I'd absolutely be eager to answer those questions now if I can. I better be. I wrote it.
I have found a few things that I want to make comments on, but I'll do that separately in an email to you rather than take the time now.
Okay. Yeah, that works too. It gives me a little bit more time to be thoughtful and reflective as opposed to responsive.
Okay, I'm gonna, let's see, you said it started page 60. I'm just gonna send that to him now. Make a note to send it to him at the end of the meeting. So Plan Commissioners, I'll send that to you with a reminder on the page that specific section starts on page 62, and I'll do that right after the meeting.
Page 67. So page 62 through 67.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So we have, what, about 30 minutes to go yet, Aaron?
Yes.
I think we might be able to tackle this thing. So the next section is landscaping requirements. So what we have in the current ordinance, with the exception of the East Gateway District, where the landscaping requirements are pretty clear and laid out pretty well, the landscape requirements for the rest of the city are a little bit more piecemeal. So there are references to open space that has to be preserved, right? So X number of % of the property must be open space. But we don't really define, we don't do a great job of defining what open space means. There's a definition, and forgive me one second, I'm going to see if I can pull it up real quickly and read it to you. So the current definition of open space is the areas of a lot which contain permeable surfaces and shall remain unbuilt and shall not be used for parking, storage, access drives, or display. The use of gravel or pavers shall not be considered permeable surface for the calculation of open space. Open space represents many different landscaping elements, including greens, quadrangles, lawns, hedgerows, gardens, pathways, walkways, groves, wooded areas, fields, and natural areas. So that's not a bad definition of open space, but from a landscaping and a planning standpoint, it doesn't provide much information. It tells you that gravel is an open space and parking areas aren't open space. It tells you that lawns are, which is problematic for reasons that we can discuss if you'd like, and then pathways and fields and natural areas and such. So there are these references within the ordinance to elements that would typically be found in a landscape plan, but not actual landscape requirements. We're not providing much direction or guidance to developers. What I'm proposing to do, and Aaron, I think we can bring this up. It begins on page 67, but I'll get you to the exact page for discussion. Thanks for your patience, by the way. I should have had this more readily at hand. So the middle of page 67, we get into the details. And again, there's the intent and purpose kind of stuff and the principles. But the important parts are when you get into the actual district requirements, and that's midway down page 68. What I'm suggesting is this section will not have landscape requirements for the B6 in the EGD district because those already exist. And I'm reticent to kind of supplant existing standards unless there's a reason to. But the big thing is you get into, we're providing direction, and perhaps when you as Plan Commission members look this over, you might rightly assume that we're providing too much direction. Maybe we're going too far from not much guidance to being a little bit too directive, and I'll defer to your judgment on that. I've found that the standards here tend to work well. They allow for flexibility. What we don't want is standards that that result in something like a Main Street America Disney landscape, right? Every 10 feet is a tree, or every 30 feet is a shrub, and they're all the same height, and they're all the same species, because that just doesn't look good. It's not beneficial from a habitat standpoint. It's not beneficial from an aesthetic standpoint, et cetera. So you want flexibility built in, but you want to create a framework within which that development occurs. So for instance, in business districts, the developer shall plant in the terrace between the sidewalk and street 1 tree per 35 feet or portion thereof of public street frontage. That does not say that there's a tree every 35 feet. It says there should be 1 tree for every 35 feet of frontage. So they could group those 2 or 3 trees, or they could space them out some way. We want to create the flexibility to allow a developer to do something that's creative. We still have the authority as staff and Plan Commission and City Council to say, no, we don't think that's what's intended here. We would request that you take it back and do something along those lines. We still have that ability, but we're creating the opportunity for developers to come before us with something that we may not have thought we would have liked, that we end up loving. The section that begins, the table that begins on the kind of midway through page 69 and stops on page 70, lists a bunch of species that I'm calling suggested plant species. The reason, well, there's a lot of reasons. These species tend to be very good in terms of their hardiness in an urban, suburban environment. None of them are invasive. None of them are, they don't have the negatives associated with some other common trees or some other common species that we'll check when we get down to the prohibited land species. But again, we're not saying that a developer has to do this. We're not saying that you have to have basswood, burrow, common hackberry, honeyclocus, red maple trees. We're saying that if we see these trees, you've met our desires, you've met our goals for this. If you have other trees, that's great. We may have questions about why you chose that tree as opposed to some of these trees. And as long as you can, justify that change, we're going to be cool with it. The only thing we have, though, is we have these prohibited landscape species. As Aaron and I discussed, I think if you haven't done it already, Aaron, I think you're going to run it by somebody at the city or at the county to kind of give a thumbs up or thumbs down.
I actually did, yeah. Russ Montgomery is our kind of quote unquote forester, and he has taken a look, and he has kind of marked a couple things up and added a couple suggestions.
Sure.
I will get that to you as soon as I am able.
Yeah, I'm not an arborist, a silviculturist at all, right? I'm a policy person. So there are certain things that, the one big shock that everybody sees is the prohibition against Norway maple. I think it's the second most common tree species planted in America. And the reason that DNR and others would like to see that tree go away is the more Norway maples you have, the quicker we will lose sugar maples as a species that can exist in the state of Wisconsin. Norway maples are very aggressive reproducers, and they outcompete sugar maples in every way. So you'll see places like Vermont, New Hampshire, parts of Canada that treat Norway maples the way the city of New York treats rats. Yet we still have them being planted all over the place. It would be one of the things, if I could snap my fingers, that tree would no longer exist on this planet, or at least it wouldn't exist on this continent. So that's the one that becomes, but most of this stuff, certainly purple loosestrife and reed canary grass and some other things, I think most of us have some general understanding of the problems with it. Most of these species are invasive, meaning they can take over a landscape, pretty as they might be. So same with the site plan, please take a look at the landscape process. And then we have 20 minutes to spend some time talking about the Fulton Street corridor concept. So right now, the Fulton Street corridor is a proposed overlay. An overlay zone is as it sounds. It lays down on top of a base zone. So the base zone is the underlying district. In this case, it's the B4 strip commercial district. So if we were to adopt the ordinance as it exists right now, the perimeter or the parameters of the Fulton Street corridor overlay would be exactly the same as the footprint of the B4 district on the zoning map. So the question then becomes, well, why don't we just recreate or rewrite the B4 strip commercial district, which is absolutely true, absolutely viable option. We could just say, something, instead of having the B4 district as we had it, we can create it so it is a mixed use district. The reason I didn't do that is I suspect, depending upon how favorable or unfavorable this concept is viewed by those of you in the room, and if implemented by landowners, it might be something that we would look at as a tool for other parts of the community, Churchill Street and some other places. And if that's the case, we would want it to be an overlay that could be applied to other places. Another thing about creating an overlay is it doesn't have to be associated with the specific boundaries of the B4. It could be associated with B4 district parcels within a contained area of, in this case, the West Fulton Street corridor. So the main difference between an overlay is, or the main concepts in an overlay is that they do not remove or change the requirements of the underlying zoning district, or the things that are allowed within the underlying zoning district. Anybody within the B4 strip commercial district would still be able to do everything that they're allowed to do right now. What the Fulton Street corridor does is say, in addition to that, you can also do these things. And these things part of it is all of those uses that are currently listed as permitted or conditional in the R1, R2, R3, B1, B2, B3, B5, B7, and I1. We're taking I2 out of the mix because heavy industry typically doesn't work well in a mixed use environment. The question then becomes, and I think, again, we've briefly discussed this in the past, how do we determine whether or not a proposed use is compatible with the parcel, adjoining uses, adjoining structures? And we do that through the site plan review process. So as you look at Fulton Street corridor in the ordinance, and Aaron, you might want to bring that up now since we're talking about it, just to give a quick visual. It begins on page 31. So as you're scrolling through page 31, 2, 3, 4, and the top of page 35, excuse me one moment. Hey, hon. As you're scrolling through that, keep in mind that the tool that will implement this concept is the site plan review process. So instead of determining whether, let me back up again, a use that is permitted by right or a permitted use is just that. If it's listed as a permitted use, nobody can prevent that landowner from doing it as long as it complies with setback requirements and height requirements and such. Special uses in the current ordinance and conditional uses have a higher degree of scrutiny due to the greater potential for offsite impacts. But if we call something a conditional use, we have to, or a special use, we have to comply with the requirements of 2017 Wisconsin Act 67. as an overlay, these aren't necessarily permitted in conditional uses, not in the sense that they would be currently. We're dealing with them through the process of site plan review. So someone, let me back up to give you the page that I want you to go to. So if you go to the bottom of page 31, Aaron, where you see conditional uses, any use listed as permitted, or et cetera. What we need to ensure within the Fulton Street corridor overlay is that these uses, all of them listed as permitted and conditional currently within those districts, have to conform to the site plan review process in order to be granted a conditional use permit. That relationship, or that reference, gives us protection under 2017 Wisconsin Act 67. So the site plan review process becomes the tool with which staff initially, and then Plan Commission, say, yes, you can build that donut shop, or no, you can't. And it's not because a donut shop is good or bad, it's because a donut shop is incompatible with whatever is right next to the proposed donut shop. You know, the light welding assembly facility, or whatever the case may be. So that's the tool that site plan review provides. It allows you to make decisions on a case-by-case basis in a way that's legally defensible. But there's a lot here in that FSC Fulton Street corridor district, right? I mean, basically, we're saying in this place, we're allowing for a level of flexibility that exists nowhere else within the city of Waupaca. And we're doing so because ostensibly we believe it's going to result in something that provides benefit to the city. This kind of dynamic, vibrant mixture of differing but compatible uses, regardless of whether they're residential, commercial, or light industrial. I think that's all I have in terms of preaching tonight. But again, we have about 15 minutes, give or take, to kind of have a Q&A on this stuff.
Does anyone have any specific questions, especially on that Fulton Street corridor or the overlay district? Okay, guys, I would encourage you to also, I would encourage you to also take a look at that. I just sent you a copy of the draft rewrite in email, which I got a couple minutes ago. So I would also, and that is on page, I'll send you.
Hey, Jeff, from not necessarily the items that are within the rewrite, but and I talked to Aaron about this either yesterday or today, but if I was a Joe citizen and I wanted to put up a fence in my yard, how would I go through this zoning code to find out what my requirements are and stuff like that?
Sure. Good question. I think. Is getting back over right now?
Brian, you've got to mute.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll change your question slightly from a fence to an accessory structure, because I think it's going to illustrate the differences between the current and proposed processes better. So right now, somebody out there, Mary Smith, decides that she wants to put up a shed in her backyard. What she's going to do is she's going to go to the city website. Or what often happens is she'll go to the city website and she'll start searching. And through that process, she will bump into, if she searches long enough, 3 different application forms, any one of which can be used to apply for this accessory structure. Again, a detached garage in the backyard or a garden shed or whatever it is. Each one of those application forms has different requirements, some of which have no bearing to either, or have little bearing to either the zoning ordinance or the building code. One of the application forms that is most often used is an application for a building permit. And it's designed to be an application form consistent with Wisconsin's commercial and residential building codes. But it's not designed to provide the information necessary for the zoning administrator to determine whether or not it's compliant with the zoning ordinance. Because again, it's a tool that was created for one thing, building codes, that's been modified over time to include the zoning aspect. So what happens is that application is submitted to the city. Typically, it'll go through Rhonda or Elizabeth. Elizabeth will forward it to me, forward it to the zoning administrator, whoever's fulfilling that position. The zoning administrator will do the initial review to determine whether or not this structure is within the height restraints and setback restraints and whatever the other restraints are. And I apologize, I'm looking here at you, but Mayor Smith is right here. So I keep glancing over this way to check out his body language as I'm talking. If he starts looking mean or his face gets red, I'm gonna put a bigger smile on my face or something. What I found myself in, the vast majority of the dozens of applications I've reviewed thus far, is having to email or call either the owner or the applicant and request additional information. Now, aside from just the fact that that's time consuming and costly to a degree for the city, right? Because when I'm doing that, I'm charging you, quite frankly, and the more I have to do that means the more I'm charging you, and I'd rather not do that part of it. I like the income, I don't like the burden that I put on my clients. So, but from the applicant standpoint, it's reasonable for them to say, well, hold it, I submitted my application, why are you calling me? Now, the response could be, well, because you submitted an incomplete application. And that's true. At some point, when we get done with this process, we're going to have processes in place that effectively stop incomplete applications from being received. That's the way the law works, right? The way the laws regarding zoning ordinances is you cannot, you may not receive and proceed with an incomplete application unless you're determining that it's complete. What I mean by that is when you accept a check up front, and the city doesn't, we're going to be talking about that more, you're taking money from the applicant, and that the receipt of that money, the transfer of that money, implies the completion of a process. Right now, the process that we have doesn't work because it requires that either Elizabeth or I keep contacting, reaching out to these owners to get additional information. So the biggest problem in the current ordinance right now, or the current process right now, is the application forms. There are multiple application forms. There's no clear process. Nobody out there, including in many cases your current zoning administrator, knows for sure which application form is the one that the applicant should be filling out. The rewritten ordinance would have two very clear application forms. If you're building something, if you're proposing something that triggers a requirement for a building permit under Chapter 14, you must submit an application under Chapter 14. If you are building something that requires an approval or authorization under the zoning ordinance, you must complete an application under Chapter 17 consistent with those requirements. The obvious question is, can't you combine those two? And frankly, the answer is no. It just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is the laws that govern zoning ordinances in the state of Wisconsin, there are 3 of them, they're called enabling statutes, are different than the laws that are different than the state's building code. So if somebody were to challenge us, I deny a permit or one of the building inspectors denies a permit, and it goes to an attorney and it goes to court, it's very difficult to defend an application review and approval process that is some Frankensteinian mixture of 2 separate codes under 2 separate sets of enabling statutes. It is much clearer to have them parallel concurrent reviews. The obvious question then is that burdensome? And the answer is absolutely not from a procedural standpoint. It's much clearer. I think when we get to the point where we have an ordinance here that you as a plan commission are comfortable with, I'm going to prepare some draft application forms for review, and we'll be able to compare the two and contrast the two. And you'll see the new forms are going to go step by step by step by step. Every single piece of information that is necessary in order for me to review and rule upon an application, but more importantly, for the applicant to have that application reviewed and approved, will be listed there. If it's completed, no more information is required. That in and of itself makes the process much more expeditious. If I had to guess, I would go from 30 minutes to 15 minutes on my reviews, or 45 minutes to 30 minutes. That's how, from a time standpoint, burdensome the current process is. It's getting less so as I become more and more familiar, but at some point, the inefficiencies in the process are not going to be able to allow me to do it faster. The big question then becomes cost. And right now, and I'm going to choose my words carefully so I don't cross over into legal interpretations, but an application process, an application fee by law must be grounded in the actual process associated with receiving, distributing, and ruling upon that application. What that means is, if we have an application fee that is $500, application for whatever, application to plant a cherry tree. If somebody were to challenge us in court, a judge is going to say, explain why you're charging this person $500 to apply for a permit to plant a cherry tree. And we need to be able to say comfortably that this is how much it costs to receive it, to make the copies, to distribute to the Plan Commission. This is how much it costs to post it in the newspaper or post it online. This is how much it costs for the Plan Commission to meet and to hold a public hearing. Total it all up and it comes up to $472, and we round it up to $500. Every judge in the nation is going to say no problem. What often happens, though, is the actual cost associated with doing it ends up being about $172, and we're charging $500. That's a problem. The reason it's a problem is, as I just stated, and the reason it's unnecessary to have exorbitant application fees is we already in the current ordinance have the provision to charge an additional fee associated with reviews outside of city staff. So if you have to hire an engineer like Strand, or an attorney to review an attorney to review something, or you're working with a consultant in a city position, those fees are paid for by the applicant through this thing called an application fee or professional review fee, or what you call it. That fee has to be specifically associated with an actual dollar amount, meaning if I invoice the city 1 hour for reviewing the permit to plant a cherry tree, my billable rate is $85. The city pays me $85. The city cannot charge the applicant $95. So my incredibly long-winded answer to your simple question is that the new process will have 2 tracks that'll be much more clearly understood, because Elizabeth is not going to have to deal with this gerrymandered UDC compliant building permit form that has a bunch of weird zoning stuff thrown in it. And the zoning administrator, whoever that person be in the future, is not going to have to deal with the alternative. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to tell a story about a situation I had a few years ago. I have a property in Vilas County. We're on a lake, fortunately, and I wanted to build some stairs down to my pier. So I applied through the township to get the permit. I also had to apply to Vilas County for a permit. And since I'm closer than 75 feet to the water, I had to apply to the DNR for a permit, which also necessitated me to go to the Army Corps of Engineers and get a waiver for these stairs. So 4 permits I needed to get. Will our new code address that issue?
That's a really good question, Alan. And as I hope Elizabeth won't mind me saying this. When she and I have these discussions about processes, she'll say something, and I'm paraphrasing. I think Aaron's alluded to this in the past too. She'll paraphrase that, that's what is done in towns, but not so much in cities. The reason it's done in towns, the reason many of these town processes are, and no disrespect intended, much more efficient than city processes is they have to be for the exact reason Alan just mentioned. You have these multiple players, right? So in a land division ordinance in a town, somebody's proposing to build a subdivision, they have to figure out whether they have to abide by the regulations of the town, the regulations of the city, which is within 1.5 or 3 miles of that property, or the regulations of the county, whichever are more stringent, which is what Chapter 236 says. So what it forces towns and counties and cities in those areas to do is to have these very efficient, very streamlined, very specific particular ordinances. How does that apply here? Well, fortunately, we don't really have to deal with the county, right? When it comes to 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark and 300 feet for a river and 1,000 feet for a lake, that stuff doesn't apply in cities in Wisconsin the way it does for unincorporated communities. The DNR is still there. The city has no, they're in many ways were preempted from certain aspects of DNR requirements. So they may exist, but what I've found pleasantly surprising in the last 3-4, I don't even know how long it's been, Aaron, the months that I've been working with you, is that the DNR office with respect to Waupaca has kind of a laissez-faire attitude when it comes to the city. And that, I hope, is because they believe that the city is doing an effective job in addressing this. So short answer to your question, Alan, is no, you would not have to go through all of that, but not just because we're hoping to improve the process. It's just the rules are much, much different in Vilas County and any county for a rural town than they are for a city. All that stormwater erosion control, shoreline zoning, all that stuff is included within one body, the city of Waupaca, not within multiple bodies.
Well, I'm encouraged because I also live on Mirror Lake in Waupaca.
Yeah, I have had a contact today from a gentleman who has a pretty nice piece of property that has a pretty significant shoreline frontage on Silver Lake. Is it Silver Lake? Am I getting the lakes right? I work in so many communities with lakes, I often get them wrong, so I apologize. But he has a number of questions. Who do I have to call at DNR, county, all this kind of stuff? And I said, basically, just interact with myself and Justin Behrens, and we'll figure out the path for you. But again, going back to the mayor's question, I think the end result of this can't be anything but a more efficient process. And it's no disrespect to the parties that played a role in creating the current ordinance or the current forms. It's just that they have been updated, amended, and revised, and updated, amended, and revised again and again and over, that they're overly complicated, don't actually provide the information that we need to make a decision. So at some point, I think we'll have a discussion about the fee schedule. I think that'll probably be a staff level discussion first, and then it'll be up to Aaron to decide what to do with it. But I do think there are fees within our current code that are burdensome in comparison to other communities.
All right, we are running up on, we're about 3 minutes over our 2-hour time limit.
Well, that's success.
But if anyone else does have a question.
You're breaking up, Aaron. It's hard to understand what you're saying.
Certainly. Okay. Well, I'm not hearing any questions, so we'll probably cover some of this towards the end of that meeting. We'll also cover the land use chapter of the comp plan, and Andrew will be presenting on that, along with maybe 1 or 2 just regular items. So, Mayor Smith, his mic's not working, so I'm just going to handle the adjournment of the meeting. So I guess at this point, if there are no further questions, we'd be looking for a motion to adjourn.
Aaron, before that motion, if I may jump in just for a moment, the issue that we discussed today regarding R1, R2, is that something that we'll be talking about at the next meeting? Do you think?
I'm going to talk about it in our development review team next Tuesday first, and
Okay.
kind of see what the team's thoughts are on it. Yeah, well, actually, Jeff, yes, it will likely get brought up, it'll get brought up, but it'll be through Andrew's presentation in the comp plan and what it means in like the single family district. So
Okay.
it will get brought up. Yeah. All right. So still looking for a motion to adjourn if
Move to adjourn.
no one else.
I think the timing's pretty good. We're losing Aaron.
Let me try and help with an echo here. So we had a motion by Alan. Who was the second? Anybody want a second on adjournment, or should we stay here all night?
I'll second.
Thank Justin.
Justin.
All right. All right, thanks. All in favor with a voice signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We're adjourned and it's 7:21 p.m. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a good night.